The temple walls seemed to breathe around them, pulsating with an insidious rhythm that matched the thudding of their hearts. Every corridor they took led them deeper, and each path seemed to twist in on itself as if the temple was alive, reshaping itself to keep them inside. The air was thick, suffocating, saturated with the metallic tang that filled their lungs with every strained breath. Captain Lena Thorne kept her flashlight trained on the path ahead, but her hands were shaking. Samira's hand, now warped and nearly unrecognizable, throbbed visibly through her suit, twisted tendons and elongated fingers pressing against the material like living roots seeking release. Samira stumbled behind, her breaths shallow and ragged, clutching her arm close as if trying to keep the transformation from spreading. We're not getting out of here, are we? Samira whispered, her voice hollow with resignation. We are, Lena insisted, her tone laced with an edge of desperation. We'll find a way out. We have to understand what we're dealing with first. But even she didn't believe her own words. With every step they took, the temple seemed to draw them deeper, and she could feel something vast and sentient stirring in the depths below them. The hum had become a low, throbbing pulse, almost like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. It reverberated through the walls, growing louder, each beat a reminder of their dwindling time. Dr. Miles, silent for most of their descent, suddenly stopped, his gaze fixed on the wall. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice tight with fear. "There's something below us." Lena turned, her flashlight casting a shaky beam across the damp, veined walls. "What do you mean?" Miles's face was pale, his eyes darting around as if he could feel the creature's presence pressing down on them. "It's waking up. Whatever this temple was built to contain, it's coming alive." As if to answer him, a deafening crack split the air. The ground beneath them trembled, sending a shower of dust and tiny stones raining down from the ceiling. Lena instinctively reached out, steadying herself against the wall, but the surface felt warm, almost like flesh. She pulled her hand back, a shiver running down her spine. In the distance, a low, guttural sound echoed through the corridors, a deep, rattling noise that was both alien and disturbingly familiar, like the sound of something ancient stirring after an eternity of rest. Lena felt the weight of it in her chest, a palpable dread that gnawed at her resolve. The temple wasn't just a structure, it was a prison, and they had triggered its awakening. They moved forward, slower now, hyper-aware of every sound and shift in the air. The corridor twisted again, leading them into a vast chamber, far larger than any they had encountered. At its center was a pool of thick, viscous liquid that glowed a sickly green, casting an otherworldly light across the walls. The chamber's floor was uneven, broken by jagged rocks and spiked formations that jutted up like teeth. Around the edges of the room, twisted pillars rose, each one embedded with what looked like mummified remains of alien creatures, beings with elongated limbs and hollow, gaping eyes that seemed to watch them, forever frozen in expressions of terror. These were sacrifices, Dr. Miles murmured, horror etched into his face. Whatever's here, it fed on them. It's been feeding for eons, drawing from whatever life wandered into its reach. Lena stepped closer to the pool, her eyes narrowing as she studied the viscous surface. It seemed to pulse in time with the hum, tiny ripples forming across its surface with each beat. And then, slowly, something began to rise. A tendril, slick and black, emerged from the liquid, glistening under the green glow. It writhed, curling and uncurling as if tasting the air. "Get back," Lena hissed, pulling the others away. But it was too late. More tendrils rose from the pool, unfurling like the limbs of some monstrous plant. They slithered across the floor, feeling their way toward the crew, attracted to the warmth of their bodies. One of the tendrils lashed out, wrapping around Samira's ankle. She screamed, thrashing against it, but it held fast, its grip tightening as it pulled her closer to the pool. Lena lunged forward, grabbing Samira's arm, struggling to pull her free. The tendril was impossibly strong, and as Lena pulled, she felt it resist, almost as if it were challenging her. Dr. Miles darted forward, his flashlight beam catching on something glinting near the pool's edge, a strange, jagged shard of metal, likely a remnant from an ancient tool. Without thinking, he snatched it up and plunged it into the tendril, severing it. A high-pitched screech filled the air, the severed tendril thrashing wildly before retracting into the pool, leaving a slick trail of dark, viscous fluid. Samira stumbled back, panting, her leg shaking uncontrollably. The place where the tendril had wrapped around her was red and raw, with thin black lines tracing along her veins, spreading from the point of contact. It's inside me," she gasped, clawing at her skin as if trying to rip the infection out. "I can feel it, spreading." Lena grabbed her shoulders, steadying her. "Hold it together. We don't have time to lose control now." But even as she spoke, she knew it was a losing battle. The entity within the temple was awake, and it was hungry. As they pressed forward, the temple's architecture became more twisted, more organic, as if they were stepping into the belly of some ancient beast. The walls pulsed with a sickly warmth, veins of dark fluid crisscrossing the surface like blood vessels. The glyphs that had once been mere carvings now seemed to undulate, shifting in and out of focus, their meanings tauntingly just out of reach. And then they saw it, the source of the hum, the heartbeat of the temple. At the far end of the chamber loomed the creature itself, a massive, amorphous being that seemed to be both part of the stone and separate from it. Its form was nightmarish, a tangle of tendrils, eyes, and elongated limbs that melded with the walls, stretching across the ceiling and down into the floor, like the roots of a monstrous tree. Its skin was a sickly, translucent gray, covered in patches of chitinous armor and strange, jagged growths. Its eyes, dozens of them, scattered across its misshapen body, opened one by one, fixing on the crew with an unnatural intelligence. The creature let out a guttural, rattling hiss, and the temple seemed to shudder in response. The air grew thick with an unseen energy, pressing down on them, filling them with a dread that clawed at their sanity. It's trying to assimilate us," Miles whispered, his voice trembling. "That's what it's been doing to everything that enters here. It's using the temple as a feeding ground, drawing in anything alive, transforming it, making it part of itself." Lena's mind raced, desperation clawing at her. They were out of options, out of time. The creature's tendrils began to stretch toward them, moving with a terrifying purpose, the tips splitting open to reveal sharp, needle-like appendages that gleamed in the green light. "We need to sever its connection to the temple," she said, her voice steady despite the terror building within her. "If this thing is feeding through the structure, we need to break the link. Maybe it'll weaken enough for us to get out." They looked around, scanning the chamber for anything that could be a focal point, a source of power or connection. At the far end of the room, behind the creature, they saw a series of large, intricately carved stones, each one etched with symbols similar to the ones that lined the entrance. "Those stones," Samira muttered, her voice strained as she pointed. "They look important." Lena nodded, understanding immediately. "If we destroy those, it might disrupt the creature's hold on this place." As the creature advanced, they sprinted toward the stones, dodging tendrils that whipped and lashed out, trying to ensnare them. Dr. Miles reached the first stone, a jagged piece that pulsed with a faint, sickly glow. Without hesitating, he grabbed the shard of metal he had used earlier and brought it down hard, shattering the stone into fragments. A horrific screech filled the chamber, the creature's body convulsing, its tendrils writhing in agony. "It's working!" Lena shouted, moving to the next stone, smashing it with all her strength. Each strike weakened the creature further, its form flickering, becoming less solid, more ethereal. But just as they reached the last stone, a massive tendril slammed into the ground in front of them, cutting off their path. The creature loomed above, its eyes blazing with fury, its limbs convulsing as it prepared to strike. "Now!" Lena shouted, desperation giving her strength. She hurled a piece of broken stone at the last pillar, shattering it. The creature let out a final, bone-rattling shriek as its form began to dissolve, its body breaking apart, melting back into the walls of the temple. The hum stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. The walls, once pulsing with life, were now still, the temple's malevolent presence finally extinguished. They stumbled back, breathless, covered in dark fluids and dust. The creature was gone, its hold over the temple broken. But as they looked around, they realized the true horror. Their bodies, marked and scarred, bore signs of the creature's touch. Veins blackened, flesh altered. They had escaped, but something of the creature lingered within them. With no other choice, they began their ascent back to the surface, each step a reminder that while they may have escaped the temple, they would never truly be free of what it had left within them. The silence was thick, crushing, and unnatural. As the last remnants of the creature dissolved back into the temple walls, Lena felt a strange stillness settle over the place, an emptiness where the malevolent hum had once been. The oppressive presence was gone, but in its wake was something equally unsettling, an awareness that this darkness had not been conquered, only pushed back into dormancy. Lena looked at her crew, those who remained. Dr. Miles was breathing heavily, his face pale, veins dark and swollen against his skin like vines creeping beneath his flesh. Samira clutched her deformed hand close to her chest, her eyes wide and distant, her breath shallow as she took in the quiet horror of their situation. The temple may have released them from its grasp, but they hadn't escaped unscathed. They bore marks of their ordeal, remnants of the alien infection that had burrowed its way into their bodies and minds. Lena's skin itched with an unnatural heat, a crawling sensation that ran beneath her veins. She knew the temple had left something in them, something that would linger long after they escaped. Let's get to the surface," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But the others heard the weight in her tone, the unspoken truth. This was not a simple escape. This was a race against something dark that now lived inside them. They stumbled through the corridors, retracing their steps back through the twisting, distorted hallways. The walls were still and silent, yet somehow they felt more ominous, as if watching their retreat with a cold, indifferent gaze. Each step echoed around them, a constant reminder of how deep they were, how far they still had to go to reach the surface. Time blurred. It was impossible to say how long they walked, their minds foggy, weighed down by the temple's residual pull. Lena's vision swam, her muscles weak, her breaths coming shallow and fast. She could feel the creature's influence growing within her, spreading with each heartbeat. A deep dread settled in her chest, but she pressed forward, refusing to let the temple's dark seed take root. Finally, they emerged into the vast open chamber where they had first encountered the alien altar. The faint light from the surface trickled down, weak and red, illuminating the massive stone structure at the room's center. The altar, though lifeless now, seemed to pulse with a lingering energy, as though it was waiting to resume its purpose, eager for new victims to bind and transform. Lena turned to her crew, her face set with a grim determination. Miles, Samira, there's only one way to make sure this place stays buried. We have to destroy the temple and everything within it. Miles's face contorted in understanding and horror. You're talking about the engine core, aren't you? His voice was hollow, resigned, as he realized the magnitude of what she was suggesting. She nodded. We'll detonate the core. The blast will be enough to bury this place, maybe even collapse the structure entirely. We have to make sure nothing survives, especially us. Samira looked down at her hand, her fingers twisted and elongated, veins blackened and pulsing faintly. She swallowed, the realization hitting her hard. So, this is it then. We won't make it out. Lena forced herself to meet Samira's gaze. We're already compromised. Whatever infected us down here, it's inside us now. We can't let this thing spread. If it reaches civilization. She trailed off, but they understood. The infection was deeper than just flesh. It was in their blood, their minds. They had become part of the temple, just as it had become part of them. There was no going back. A resigned silence fell over them as they prepared. Lena handed Dr. Miles the ship's emergency detonator, her fingers lingering just a moment too long as she met his gaze. She saw the fear there, the unspoken regret, but beneath it all she saw acceptance. Set the timer for 5 minutes, she said softly. That should give you both time to get far enough away to make it to the surface. But, Lena, Samira began, her voice choked, realizing what Lena was planning. Lena shook her head. I'll stay here. I need to make sure it detonates without interference. You two have a chance. The temple, it's focused on me. It knows I'm the one who led us here. I can feel it, drawing on me. Miles shook his head, his voice breaking. Lena, you don't have to do this, we can all. But he didn't finish. He knew the truth, the futility of escape. If they left, they would carry the infection with them, a slow, insidious parasite that would spread to others, one by one, until the entire galaxy was infected. Go, Lena said firmly. I'll keep the temple distracted. It'll focus on me. Buy you the time you need. Tears glistened in Samira's eyes as she reached out, clasping Lena's hand one last time. I'm sorry, Captain. I'm sorry we came here. Lena forced a smile, though it felt hollow. We did what explorers are meant to do. We found something beyond us, something ancient. We did what we were meant to. Now we have to make sure no one else does. Without another word, she turned back to the altar, the stone cold and unyielding beneath her touch. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath, focusing her mind. She felt the temple's presence stirring, shifting, as if realizing her intent. She let it consume her, her body tingling with the alien energy, feeling the ancient entity wrapping around her mind like a vice. Behind her, she heard the distant footsteps of Miles and Samira as they retreated, their breaths ragged with the pain of leaving her behind. She listened until their sounds faded, leaving her alone in the silent, empty chamber. She held the detonator in her hand, her thumb poised over the button. 5 minutes. The timer blinked, each second a reminder of the life she was surrendering, the lives she was saving. She breathed in deeply, embracing the finality of it, letting go of the fear. As she waited, the temple seemed to grow restless, the stones vibrating, the walls stretching, the ceiling bending downward as if in fury. The creature's essence, whatever was left of it, surged toward her, tendrils of energy wrapping around her body, digging into her skin, melding with her thoughts, her memories. It was an invasion, an attempt to take her fully, to twist her will into its own. But Lena was ready. She had no fear left to give, only resolve. In the final moments, the hum of the temple reached a crescendo, a deafening roar that filled every inch of space around her, consuming her thoughts, her senses. She closed her eyes, her thumb pressing down on the detonator's button, activating the 5-minute countdown. "Goodbye," she whispered to herself, to the crew, to the memories of everyone she had ever known. "May you never find this place." The last thing she felt was the alien energy surging through her, a wave of heat and pain and darkness. She surrendered to it, her body dissolving into the creature's hunger, letting it consume her as the timer ticked down, each second a heartbeat closer to oblivion. Above, on the planet's surface, Dr. Miles and Samira stumbled across the rocky terrain, running as fast as their weakened bodies would allow. They reached the edge of a cliff, turning back just in time to see the temple's entrance tremble, then implode as a shockwave ripped through the ground, followed by a blinding flash of light. The ground quaked beneath them, the sky darkening as the temple collapsed in on itself, buried beneath tons of rock and stone. A deep, guttural roar echoed across the landscape, as if the planet itself mourned the loss of something ancient, something powerful. Then silence. Miles and Samira stood on the cliff's edge, breathing hard, staring at the spot where the temple had been. There was nothing left but dust and rubble, the faint scent of burnt air. The silence stretched, heavy with grief and relief, as they realized they were truly alone. Miles looked at Samira, his voice trembling. She saved us. She saved everyone." Samira nodded, her eyes wet, her twisted hand clutched to her chest. They stood there a long time, gazing into the emptiness, the memory of the horrors below forever etched into their minds. They knew they could never truly escape what had happened, the scars that marked their flesh a constant reminder. But they had survived, and that in some way was a victory. As they turned to leave, the red sun cast long shadows across the barren landscape, and they walked into the dawn, carrying with them the memory of the sacrifice that had saved them all. Behind them, the temple lay buried, silent and defeated. But in the cold darkness, in the spaces between stone and dust, something ancient and patient waited, silent, biding its time. And as the last echoes of the explosion faded, the barren planet returned to its endless, empty stillness, the secrets of its horrors buried, for now, beneath layers of rock and silence.